Hello and welcome to week 5 of Humanities 1301 online. This week we are looking at the time machine. So, before we get started, I just wanted to make sure that everybody is aware that while I really do want to talk about the time machine, I'm not going to be summarizing the story here because you should have read it. That's actually very important that you read the story itself because we're going to be not only having some assignments with it, the discussion questions and the reader response, but we're also going to be writing a larger compare and contrast analytical essay later after we finish reading Morlock Night. So be sure to read the story. Answer the discussion questions. Those will all be due on Saturday, as well as the Time Machine Reader Response class discussion, which will also be due on Saturday. That's a discussion board. The discussion questions are an individual assignment, and Chapter 4 questions and comments is this week's Wednesday discussion board that will count for attendance. All right, some points about the Time Machine, written by H.G. Wells. So, what is the Time Machine? It is a basic example of Victorian science fiction. Written by a Victorian during the Victorian times, it is squarely Victorian. I say this is important because you need to understand that while it is the progenitor of steampunk, it is the inspiration for steampunk, Victorian science fiction is not steampunk. So you have H.G. Wells as an author, you have Jules Verne, you could also throw Edgar Allan Poe in there and several other writers. These are squarely Victorian era writers. They are Victorian. Are they writing science fiction? Yes. And it's actually the beginnings of science fiction as we know it. But they are not writing steampunk. It is merely the inspiration for steampunk. One of the most important works of Victorian science fiction is The Time Machine. And while H.G. Wells did not write The Time Machine as an actual work of science fiction, in fact, they didn't call it science fiction back then. It was called a romance. And that idea being based on the romantic idea of adventure, not necessarily the romantic idea as we would know it today as the lovey-dovey romance novels. But in this case, they were called romantic adventures because it was a romantic idea to think that you would go off and adventure and come back and do things and affect people in certain ways. So that being said, it stands as the, I guess, foundation of what we know as science fiction today. Mostly because it talks about fantastical things. The time machine in and of itself is fantastical. It's a fantastical object that did not exist. It was an imaginative object that did not actually exist and frankly still doesn't, although the time machine, the story itself, has inspired people, scientifically minded people, to try and create a time machine. Much like the phenomenon that we see in science fiction shows like Star Trek, where you have things that don't exist. They certainly didn't exist in 1960s when Star Trek was on the air in 1968. We didn't have communicators. We didn't have tablets. We didn't have transformers. Well, where people are being transferred from one place to another. That wasn't in extent, but it is now to some extent. We now have basically your phone is like one of their conferencing devices, and you have the tablets, which we can now write on. Everybody knows what a tablet is. We can walk around with this and we can transfer information. We can write on it. We can play videos on it. We can use it as a camera and infrared device and all sorts of things. So a lot of these things have come true. Now, the In terms of moving people from one space to another, doesn't really exist, doesn't really work, but they are working on it, and there are studies, and if you're interested, you can go find them, where they've actually started moving atoms across from one space in a room to another space in a room, which doesn't sound, super exciting until you realize that they actually did transfer them. The idea of transferring an entire being, that's really complicated, but it's getting there. But that being said, all of these things are inspiration for science that we know now, much like how the Victorian science fiction inspires steampunk science fiction, except it's way more imaginative. For example, we do have lasers, IRL, right? In real life, we have lasers. We don't have laser pistols. We're probably not that far from it, but we still don't have them. A blaster, if you will. But we could. So, interestingly enough, the Victorian science fiction is the beginnings of where we see actual literature, imaginative literature, inspiring real world people to try to make these things happen. So in that way, it makes it very important. And I would say that the Time Machine is one of the most important pieces of literature for those purposes. Now, did H.G. Wells write it with that in mind? He did not. He wrote the Time Machine as a call to the problems that existed in Victorian society that had come up because of the Industrial Revolution. It was trying to call attention to the plight of the workers, as it were, and see if you can see that in the Eloi and the Morlocks. Who were the Eloi? Who were the Morlocks? This is where his social justice work basically comes into play, where he's trying to point out these problems in society. So H.G. Wells never tried to write a science fiction piece with this. The part about the time machine and all of that being fantastical was simply a plot device to point out what he thought people were going to evolve into, or devolve, as this case may be, in the future. And remember, in this story, he's going way into the future, almost 1 million years into the future. He's going to the year 800,000 and something. So keep that in mind. But most importantly, Verne and Jules are not steampunk, but instead the inspiration for steampunk. Anybody who calls them steampunk would be incorrect. However, steampunk science fiction does owe its originality to both Wells and Verne and several others. So that's why it's important. But in any case, I really can't get into the story too much. Like I said, you're going to need to read it. If you have any questions regarding it specifically, please email me and I'll be happy to discuss it with you there. Or you can discuss it in the discussion board, the Q&A for the class if you're interested. But I would highly, highly recommend discussing it in the reader response discussion board that will be due on Saturday. I think that you guys can have some really great discussions there, and draw on the discussion questions, the 10 discussion questions from the story for your reader response. There's also some other questions here that I have for you to think about is how is it a commentary on the human condition? How do you think Wells feels about the Industrial Revolution and the technology of his time? Is it a hopeful story? Is there a message regarding humanity? These are the things I want you guys to think about. And finally, why does it seem like humans are obsessed with fictional stories about time travel? If you were to look at the internet, just hop onto YouTube and put in time travel, and you'll come up with literally thousands of videos about supposed time travelers, whether or not it's possible. I think it would be fair to say that we as humans are kind of obsessed with it. Is it because we don't like living with regret? Is it because we don't have too much foreknowledge? Is it because we have a burning desire to change things? You tell me. In any case, that's what we're looking at in week 5. Again, if you have any questions, as always, email me or put it up in the question and answer discussion board. And I hope you've enjoyed the story. You should be looking at Morlock Night next. So Morlock Night can also be found over here in the novels section. Right here, it's already open. So be sure to start reading that, because Morlock Night will be in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about Morlock Night. If you're still having any problems with the textbook, just be sure to order it as soon as you can. I'm sorry I don't have better links, but I have all the way up to chapter 5 and 10 here for you. So be sure to get that as soon as you can. Again, any questions, let me know. Have a great week.